To truly understand the Battle of Iwo Jima, we must begin not on its black shores, but in the cold, high-altitude realm of strategic bombing, some 30,000 feet above the Japanese home islands. By late 1944, the fulcrum of the Pacific War had shifted decisively. The American war machine, an industrial titan of seemingly limitless capacity, was tightening its grip on the Empire of Japan. The Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam had been wrested from Japanese control in a series of bloody, hard-fought campaigns. From these islands, a new and terrible instrument of war began to fly north, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. These were magnificent aircraft, the pinnacle of aeronautical engineering of their day. Pressurized, armed with remote-controlled machine gun turrets, and capable of carrying enormous bomb loads over vast distances, the B-29 was designed for a single, brutal purpose: to dismantle the industrial capacity of Japan and, by doing so, break its will to continue the fight. The strategy, championed by leaders like General Curtis LeMay of the 20th Air Force, was one of systematic destruction from the air, a way to potentially avoid the cataclysmic casualties that an invasion of the Japanese mainland would inevitably entail. However, the B-29 campaign was fraught with peril. The flight from the Marianas to targets like Tokyo or Nagoya and back was a grueling odyssey of over 3,000 miles, pushing the superfortress to the absolute limits of its range. Crews faced not only formidable anti-aircraft fire and increasingly desperate Japanese fighter pilots over the target, but also the treacherous, high-velocity winds of the jet stream, which could consume fuel at an alarming rate. The most dangerous part of the mission was often the long, lonely flight home over an empty, unforgiving ocean. A single engine failure, a punctured fuel line, or significant battle damage often became a death sentence. For the thousands of airmen in these stricken bombers, there was no friendly territory, no safe haven. The option was to ditch in the vast, cold Pacific, where the chances of rescue were infinitesimally small. The losses in both multi-million-dollar aircraft and highly trained crews were mounting to a level that threatened the viability of the entire strategic bombing campaign. It was a problem that demanded a geographical solution. American strategic planners, poring over their vast charts of the Pacific, saw it. There, sitting almost precisely halfway between the Marianas and Tokyo, was a tiny pork-chop-shaped island of volcanic origin. It was only 8 square miles, a seemingly insignificant speck in the ocean. Its name in Japanese meant Sulfur Island, Iwo Jima. From a strategic standpoint, the logic of capturing Iwo Jima was cold, clear, and compelling. Its value was threefold. First, and most urgently, it would provide an emergency airfield for damaged B-29s returning from Japan. It would be a sanctuary, a life raft in the middle of the ocean that could save thousands of airmen and their precious aircraft. Second, its 2 existing airfields, once captured and expanded, could serve as a base for long-range American fighter planes, specifically the P-51 Mustang. These fighters could then escort the B-29s all the way to their targets and back, protecting them from Japanese interceptors and drastically improving the effectiveness and survivability of the bombing raids. Third, taking Iwo Jima would deny its use to the enemy. The Japanese were using the island as a critical early warning radar station, giving their homeland defenses a 2-hour heads-up before every B-29 raid. They were also launching nuisance bombing attacks from Iwo Jima against the American air bases in the Marianas. For all these reasons, the decision was made. Operation Detachment, the invasion of Iwo Jima, was set in motion. The island had to be taken. For the Japanese High Command, however, Iwo Jima represented something far more profound than a mere strategic outpost. Unlike the other islands the Americans had fought for across the Central Pacific, mandated territories or colonial possessions, Iwo Jima was, legally and spiritually a part of Japan itself. It was administered by the Tokyo prefectural government. Its soil was considered sacred homeland soil. To allow an enemy to stand on this ground was an intolerable dishonor. Its defense, therefore, would be absolute, a final stand to protect the nation's spiritual frontier. The man chosen to command this desperate defense was Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi. He was a complex and atypical Japanese officer. An aristocrat by birth, he was also a poet, a calligrapher, and a devoted family man. Crucially, he had served as a military attaché in the United States in the 1920s. He had traveled across the country from Washington, D.C. to Fort Bliss, Texas. He had seen the sprawling factories of Detroit, the forests of oil derricks, the endless highways filled with automobiles. He understood in a way that many of his contemporaries in the Japanese military establishment did not, the sheer, overwhelming industrial power of America. He harbored no illusions about Japan's ability to win a conventional war of attrition. He knew that the traditional tactics of the Japanese army, the glorious but ultimately suicidal banzai charges against fortified positions, were exercises in futility against the firepower the Americans could bring to bear. Such tactics had led to swift and predictable slaughter on islands like Saipan. Kuribayashi would not repeat those mistakes. When he arrived on Iwo Jima in June of 1944, he found a garrison preparing for a conventional defense of the beaches. He immediately scrapped the plan. He instituted a new, brutal, and pragmatic doctrine. There would be no banzai charges. There would be no futile defense at the water's edge. His goal was not to defeat the American invasion. In his private correspondence, he made it clear he believed that was impossible. His objective was singular and chilling, to inflict such a high number of casualties on the attacking Americans that their morale and the morale of their home front would shatter. He wanted to make the price of victory so horrifyingly high that America would recoil from the prospect of invading the Japanese home islands. He issued a simple, stark command to his 21,000 defenders. Each man was to kill 10 Americans before he himself was killed. This was not a battle for victory. It was a battle for attrition. To achieve this, Kuribayashi resolved to turn the island of Iwo Jima itself into a weapon. The island's geology, a soft volcanic rock and ash, made surface construction difficult but was ideal for excavation, and so began one of the most remarkable feats of military engineering of the entire war. Over the next 8 months, under Kuribayashi's fanatical direction, the Japanese garrison, aided by thousands of Korean forced laborers working in hellish, sulfurous conditions, transformed the island into a subterranean fortress of breathtaking complexity. They dug more than 11 miles of interconnected tunnels, some as deep as 75 feet underground. These tunnels linked over 1,500 man-made caves, chambers, command posts, aid stations, and ammunition dumps. This was a defense in depth, a three-dimensional battlefield. Artillery pieces were not placed in open pits where they could be easily spotted and destroyed by naval gunfire. Instead, they were hidden deep within caves, protected by thick steel doors. The crews would roll the guns out, fire a few carefully aimed salvos at pre-registered targets on the beaches, and then immediately roll them back into the safety of the rock before American spotters could get a fix on their position. Machine gun nests were encased in thick, reinforced concrete pillboxes, many with interlocking fields of fire, their apertures so small and well camouflaged as to be nearly invisible. Mortar tubes were dug into pits across the island, each one meticulously registered to drop shells on every square yard of the landing beaches. Kuribayashi's defensive masterpiece was the northern part of the island, a hellish, broken landscape of rocky ridges, steep gorges, and tangled ravines that the Marines would later christen the Meat Grinder. This entire sector was hollowed out and fortified, but the anchor of his entire defensive scheme was the island's most prominent feature, Mount Suribachi, the 554-foot dormant volcano at the southern tip. Kuribayashi's men turned Suribachi into a veritable fortress with 7 stories of tunnels, observation posts, and gun emplacements that gave the Japanese a commanding view of the entire southern end of the island, most importantly, the designated landing beaches. Kuribayashi's plan was diabolical in its patience. He ordered his men to hold their fire as the Americans landed. He would allow them to come ashore, to pile up men, vehicles, and supplies. He would wait until the beaches were choked, crowded, and chaotic. Only then, when the target was at its most concentrated and vulnerable, would he unleash the full fury of his hidden arsenal, turning the landing zones into a perfectly orchestrated killing field. Every Japanese soldier was chained to his post by this network of tunnels, ordered to fight from his position until death. There would be no surrender and no retreat. They were to become one with the island, ghosts in the rock, waiting to bleed the enemy white. As Kuribayashi's men toiled in the volcanic earth, the American invasion force, the largest yet assembled for a single Pacific amphibious operation, gathered at sea, designated the 5th Amphibious Corps. Under the overall command of Marine General Holland M. Howland Mad Smith and the tactical command of Major General Harry Schmidt, the force consisted of 3 Marine divisions, the 3rd, the 4th, and the 5th. The 3rd and 4th were combat-hardened veterans of campaigns like Bougainville and Guam. The 5th Marine Division was newly formed but well-trained, a mix of green recruits and experienced officers eager to prove itself in combat. In total, some 70,000 Marines would be making the assault, with another 40,000 sailors and support personnel offshore. They were arrayed against Kuribayashi's 21,000 defenders. The odds, on paper, seemed overwhelmingly in America's favor. Confidence among the Americans was high, perhaps dangerously so. Naval intelligence had underestimated the extent of Kuribayashi's fortifications. They believed the Japanese would defend the beaches in a conventional manner and that a massive preliminary bombardment would neutralize most of the island's defenses. For 74 consecutive days, the island was subjected to intermittent bombing. In the 3 days immediately preceding the invasion, this was augmented by a colossal naval bombardment. Task Force 58, a flotilla of battleships, heavy cruisers, and destroyers, unleashed thousands of tons of high-explosive shells onto the tiny island. From the decks of the transport ships, the Marines watched as Iwo Jima was continuously shrouded in smoke and fire. It seemed impossible that anything could survive such a cataclysm. The prevailing sentiment was that the battle would be a short, sharp affair, perhaps lasting no more than 5 days. The Navy had promised them the island had been pulverized. They were catastrophically wrong. The naval gunfire, while spectacular, was largely ineffective against Kuribayashi's deep-dug, rock and concrete-shielded fortifications. The shells churned the loose volcanic surface, creating more craters and obstacles for the attackers, but left the core of the Japanese defensive network almost entirely intact. Deep in their tunnels, the Japanese defenders simply waited out the storm, listening to the thunder above, conserving their strength and ammunition for the real battle to come. On the night of February 18, 1945, a tense quiet settled over the vast American armada. On the crowded transport ships, Marines made their final preparations. They cleaned rifles already pristine, sharpened bayonets, wrote what might be their last letters home. Chaplains held services on open decks under a starless sky. These were young men, most of them teenagers or in their early 20s, about to be thrown into the crucible. They looked out at the dark, ominous silhouette of the island on the horizon, dominated by the brooding presence of Mount Suribachi. It appeared lifeless, dormant. It was anything but. It was a loaded gun waiting for the pressure on the trigger. D-Day, February 19, 1945, began with a clear sky and a calm sea. At 0900 hours, H hour arrived. The naval bombardment, which had resumed at dawn, reached a final deafening crescendo, a rolling thunder that seemed to shake the very ocean. Then, as the fire lifted and shifted inland, an eerie silence descended, broken only by the roar of aircraft overhead. The first waves of landing craft, hundreds of amphibious tractors known as Amtraks, churned toward the shore, carrying the men of the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions. As they approached the island, the Marines got their first clear look at the beaches. They were not the pleasant, hard-packed sand they had trained on. Instead, they were steep, terraced slopes of soft, black volcanic ash. The first Amtraks ground their way onto this alien landscape, and their forward ramps slammed down. Marines poured out, instinctively bracing for a hail of machine gun fire. For a few surreal moments, there was almost nothing. The silence from the island was unnerving. A few sporadic shells fell, but there was none of the expected concentrated fire. This was the calculated genius of Kuribayashi's plan. He was letting them come. He was allowing the beaches to fill up, drawing more and more targets into his pre-sighted kill box. The Marines' immediate struggle was not with the enemy, but with the island itself. The volcanic ash was like coarse, loose gravel. It offered no traction. Running was nearly impossible. Each step was a struggle, sinking ankle-deep or more. Heavily laden men floundered. Worse, it was impossible to dig a foxhole. The loose ash simply collapsed back into any hole that was dug. The steep, 15-foot-high terraces that ran parallel to the shore were formidable obstacles, forcing men to crawl on their hands and knees to get over them. The follow-on waves of tanks, trucks, and jeeps became hopelessly bogged down, their wheels and tracks spinning uselessly in the soft ground, creating a massive, chaotic traffic jam right on the shoreline. The beaches were rapidly becoming precisely what Kuribayashi had envisioned, a bottleneck of disorganized men and machines. Then, when the beaches were choked with the first several waves of the invasion, Kuribayashi gave the order to open fire. From 1,000 hidden positions, the island came alive. It was as if a volcano had erupted, not with lava, but with steel. From Mount Suribachi in the south and the rocky highlands of the Motoyama Plateau in the north, a perfectly coordinated storm of fire descended upon the landing zones. Mortar shells, which made a terrifying chuffing sound as they left their tubes, rained down with pinpoint accuracy. The Japanese had spent months registering every grid square of the beaches, and the shells walked up and down the shoreline in a relentless, systematic barrage. The explosions threw up geysers of black sand and shrapnel. Artillery pieces, hidden in their caves, added their devastating weight. Machine guns opened up from concrete pillboxes that were invisible until they spat fire. Riflemen in camouflage spider holes added to the cacophony. The effect was instantaneous and apocalyptic. The beach, which had been a scene of organized chaos moments before, became a charnel house. Men were scythed down in droves. Entire squads were wiped out in a single mortar barrage. The carefully planned waves of the assault disintegrated into small, desperate groups of survivors, huddling for any cover they could find. The slight protection of a terrace, the wreckage of a vehicle, the bodies of their fallen comrades. The noise was a physical assault, a constant, deafening roar of explosions, the crack of rifles, the staccato hammering of machine guns, and woven through it all, the terrible sound of human suffering. Amidst the carnage, the Navy corpsmen, the medics, performed acts of incredible bravery, rushing into the firestorm to treat the wounded, applying tourniquets and bandages, and trying to drag casualties back toward the relative safety of the water's edge. Their casualty rate was among the highest of any group in the battle. For the individual Marine on the beach, the grand strategy was irrelevant. Survival was the only mission, and the only way to survive was to move forward, to get off the beach, to attack the source of the fire. It was a brutal choice. Stay on the beach and die, or move forward and maybe die. And so, inch by bloody inch, they began to move forward. The initial assault had two main prongs: To the south, the 28th Marine Regiment of the 5th Division was tasked with one of the most difficult assignments of the day: to drive across the narrowest part of the island, isolate Mount Suribachi, and then conquer it. To the north, the rest of the 4th and 5th Divisions were to push inland, seize the first of the island's 2 airfields, and then begin the bloody business of assaulting the main Japanese defensive belt in the Rocky Highlands. The fight for Mount Suribachi was a brutal, vertical battle against a fortified mountain. The Marines of the 28th Regiment had to advance uphill in full view of the Japanese defenders honeycombed inside the volcano. Progress was measured in yards, sometimes feet, and paid for in blood. It was here that the grim but essential tactics of the Pacific War were perfected. A squad would be pinned down by fire from a nearly invisible Japanese pillbox. Under a hail of covering fire from his comrades, a demolition team, armed with satchel charges of high explosives, would have to crawl forward. They would be followed by a flamethrower team carrying their heavy, cumbersome tanks. The demo team would get close enough to blast the opening of the pillbox, and the flamethrower operator would then douse the interior with a jet of jellied gasoline, a terrifying weapon that incinerated the occupants and consumed the oxygen within the bunker. This grim sequence, corkscrew and blowtorch, was repeated hundreds of times. For 4 agonizing days, the 28th Marines clawed their way up the steep, ash-covered slopes of Suribachi, rooting out Japanese defenders from caves and pillboxes. The fighting was savage and intimate. Finally, on the morning of February 23rd, the 4th day of the battle, a 40-man patrol from Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, under the command of Lieutenant Harold Schreier, managed to reach the volcano's summit. Finding it surprisingly quiet as the remaining Japanese had withdrawn into their deeper tunnels, the patrol looked for a way to signal their success to the thousands of men still fighting below and to the ships at sea. They found a length of Japanese water pipe and attached a small American flag that their battalion adjutant had carried ashore. At approximately 10:30 that morning, as the small flag was raised and fluttered in the wind atop Suribachi, a powerful wave of emotion swept across the island and the fleet. Ships' horns blared. Men on the beaches and in the thick of the fighting stopped for a moment and cheered. It was the first tangible symbol of victory, a defiant gesture against the hell they were enduring. Watching from a command ship, Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal was deeply moved. He turned to General Holland Smith and said, "Holland, the raising of that flag on Suribachi means a Marine Corps for the next 500 years." Forrestal's words proved prophetic, but for a reason he could not have anticipated. The command decided that the first flag was too small to be easily seen from the northern end of the island. A larger flag was sent up the mountain with a runner. A few hours after the first flag raising, this second, much larger flag was hoisted. Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal, who had just missed the first flag raising, was there for the second. As 5 Marines and 1 Navy corpsman struggled to plant the flagpole in the difficult volcanic ground, Rosenthal snapped a picture without even looking through his viewfinder. He had no idea what he had captured. That single photograph would become the most iconic image of the Second World War, perhaps of any war. It was a moment of heroic, synchronized effort, a masterpiece of composition that seemed to symbolize the collective strength and determination of the American war effort. When transmitted back to the United States, it became an instant sensation. It was plastered on the front page of nearly every newspaper used to sell billions of dollars in war bonds, and would eventually be immortalized in the massive Marine Corps War Memorial in Washington, D.C. But the photograph, for all its power, was a profound distortion of the reality of Iwo Jima. The battle was not over. It had barely begun. While that flag flew heroically over Suribachi, the main battle for the island was shifting north into the labyrinthine defenses that Kuribayashi had prepared. The very worst of the fighting was yet to come. With Suribachi secured, the three Marine divisions could now turn their full attention northward in a line abreast to begin the grinding, agonizing advance through the heart of the island. What lay before them was a landscape from a nightmare. It was a chaotic jumble of volcanic rock, ridges, gorges, and shattered terrain, which the Marines gave grim names like the Amphitheater, Turkey Knob, and Hill 382, a place they simply called the Meat Grinder. This was the core of Kuribayashi's defense in depth, and here the battle descended into a kind of warfare that had rarely been seen before. The fighting was not linear. Because of the Japanese tunnel system, the battlefield was three-dimensional. A platoon of Marines might fight for hours to take a ridge, suffering heavy casualties to wipe out a series of pillboxes, only to be attacked from behind by Japanese soldiers emerging from hidden tunnel entrances in the very ground they had just secured. No ground was ever truly safe. The front line was everywhere and nowhere. It was a battle of small units, of squads and fire teams, fighting isolated, desperate battles for a few yards of worthless rock. The Japanese defenders were tenacious and fanatically brave. They fought from their positions until they were killed. They used their tunnel networks to pop up in unexpected places, fire a few shots, and then disappear back into the earth. They staged small, localized counterattacks at night, infiltrating Marine lines to create chaos. The psychological toll on the Marines was immense. Men were in the front lines for weeks on end with no respite. They were constantly wet, cold, and filthy, living in foxholes surrounded by the unburied dead of both sides. Sleep was a luxury snatched in moments between shellings. The constant strain, the ever-present threat of death from any direction, pushed men to the absolute limits of human endurance. Cases of combat fatigue, what was then called battle neurosis, skyrocketed. The advance was agonizingly slow. The Marines pushed forward, yard by bloody yard, using the same corkscrew and blowtorch tactics they had employed on Suribachi. Tanks were brought forward, often used as mobile artillery, blasting away at concrete emplacements at point-blank range. But even the powerful Sherman tanks were vulnerable to hidden anti-tank guns and Japanese soldiers who would swarm them with magnetic mines and satchel charges. Every feature of the terrain became a miniature fortress that had to be reduced. The amphitheater was a natural bowl-shaped depression, surrounded by high ground from which the Japanese poured down devastating fire. Turkey Knob was a fortified hillock that, along with the amphitheater and Hill 382, formed a defensive triangle that stalled the Marine advance for days. The fighting was relentless. Casualty rates, especially among junior officers and non-commissioned officers who had to lead the assaults, were horrific. Platoons were chewed up, companies were decimated. Fresh-faced replacements were brought ashore, given a rifle, and thrown into the line, often to become casualties within hours. The legendary Marine hero, Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone, who had received the Medal of Honor for his actions on Guadalcanal and had returned to the fleet voluntarily, was killed on the very first day of the battle, near the edge of the first airfield. As the battle dragged on into March, the American superiority in firepower began to tell. The Marines, through sheer grit and courage, were slowly, systematically, grinding down Kuribayashi's defenses. But the Japanese general, deep in his command bunker in the north, refused to yield. He continued to orchestrate his defense, shifting his dwindling reserves through the tunnels to meet the latest American thrust. On March 8th, in a remarkable event, the first crippled B-29, named Dynamite, made an emergency landing on the captured southern airfield while the battle still raged just a few thousand yards to the north. It was the first of many, a tangible validation of the strategic reason for the invasion. By the middle of March, the Japanese were broken into isolated pockets of resistance, their tunnel network fragmented, their command and control shattered. Yet, they fought on. Kuribayashi, realizing the end was near, sent his final dispatch to Tokyo. "We have not eaten or drunk for 5 days," he wrote, "but our fighting spirit is still high. We are going to fight bravely to the last." On the night of March 25th, with organized resistance all but over, Kuribayashi carried out one final desperate act. Leading the last few hundred able-bodied defenders, including walking wounded, he emerged from his command cave and led a surprise attack against the American lines near the 2nd Airfield. It was not a chaotic banzai charge, but a silent, well-organized infiltration that descended into a savage, hand-to-hand melee in the darkness. When the sun rose on March 26th, the bodies of nearly 300 Japanese, including, it is believed, General Kuribayashi himself, lay among the American dead. His body was never definitively identified. With this final act of defiance, the Battle of Iwo Jima was declared officially over. It had lasted 36 days. Now, we must confront the terrible arithmetic of the battle, the butcher's bill. Of the 70,000 Marines who made the assault, more than 26,000 became casualties. 6,821 of them were killed or died of their wounds. It remains the bloodiest battle in the history of the United States Marine Corps. For the Japanese, the cost was near total annihilation. Of the approximately 21,000 defenders, it is estimated that over 20,000 were killed. Only a few hundred were taken prisoner, most of them captured unconscious or wounded. Iwo Jima holds a unique and grim distinction in the Pacific War. It was the only major battle in which the total American casualties exceeded those of the Japanese. This staggering cost inevitably leads to the most persistent and difficult question about the battle. Was it worth it? For decades, the orthodox answer was an unequivocal yes. The justification rested on the numbers. By the end of the war, 2,251 B-29 superfortresses had made emergency landings on Iwo Jima, saving the lives of 24,761 American airmen. By this metric, the number of airmen saved was more than 3 times the number of Americans killed taking the island. The island's use as a fighter base for P-51 escorts also allowed the B-29s to switch to more effective daylight precision bombing, further hastening the war's end. This was the view of the men who fought there and of the military command that ordered them to do so. However, in more recent years, a revisionist historical perspective has challenged this narrative. Some historians argue that the strategic necessity of the island was overstated. They point out that soon after Iwo Jima was taken, General LeMay shifted the B-29 strategy from high-altitude daylight bombing to low-altitude nighttime incendiary raids, which did not require fighter escorts. They also analyzed the emergency landings, suggesting that many were for relatively minor issues like low fuel, and that a significant number of those B-29s could have made it back to the Marianas. The core of this argument is that while the island was certainly useful, its utility did not justify the horrific price paid in the lives of United States Marines. It is a painful and complex debate, one without an easy answer. What is not debatable are the lessons that were learned from the volcanic soil of Iwo Jima. The ferocity and fanaticism of the Japanese defense provided a terrifying preview of what an invasion of the Japanese home islands, Operation Downfall, would entail. The military planners projected that such an invasion could cost as many as 1 million American casualties. The experience of Iwo Jima and the subsequent, even bloodier battle for Okinawa weighed heavily on the mind of President Harry Truman. The image of Marines burning and blasting Japanese soldiers out of caves, one by one, presented a stark vision of a future that would involve repeating that process across the entirety of Japan. In this sense, the sheer horror of Iwo Jima was a significant factor in the chain of reasoning that led to the decision to use the atomic bomb, a weapon that, in Truman's view, would make the apocalyptic invasion of Japan unnecessary. In the end, the legacy of Iwo Jima is dual and deeply conflicted. There is the legacy of the photograph, a symbol of triumphant collective heroism that inspired a nation. And then there is the legacy of the battle itself, a 36-day descent into industrialized subterranean hell, a brutal close-quarters struggle that tested the limits of human endurance and courage. It stands as a monument to the extraordinary valor of the United States Marines and their Navy corpsmen who fought and died there. And it remains a chilling, sobering reminder of the true cost of war, a cost measured not in strategic objectives, but in individual lives, buried forever in the black volcanic ash of a small, sulfurous island in the Pacific.